Good morning and welcome to my Week 13 Education Policy presentation. This is Richard Moreland, and I will be presenting School Boards and Funding, Interaction of Cities and Independent School Districts. This project has been derived from 3 reading sources assigned from class. School Finance and Property Taxes by Joan Youngman from April of 2016. I found that to be a fairly interesting read about the history and current condition of school funding in California. It seems to me that the California model originally started out with good intent back in the early part of the 70s. Of course, it discussed a little bit about Proposition 13, which was pretty much a hotbed of finance reform in the late 70s, and was as I recall, a pretty big deal nationwide. It got quite a bit of press because it was groundbreaking in the sense of how they proposed to generate funding for education throughout the entire state of California. The next reading was the overview of school funding in Texas, the Financial Responsibility Guide 2016 by the Texas Association of School Boards, Incorporated, and it was written and reviewed by Catherine Clark. Most of my presentation refers back to this document or this article. Simply because we're in Texas, I'm familiar with a number of school districts here in the state, and how through several years of litigation, we've seemed to kind of hammer out a reasonably good plan. However, there's still a lot of room for improvement, and hopefully we'll find that our state government is at least moving in the right direction. Our last reading source was the Educational Administration Quarterly, Volume 50, Suburban School Districts and Demographic Change, The Technical, Normative, and Political Dimensions of Response by Jennifer Jellison Holm, Sarah Deem, and Anjali Welton. Another interesting read, a lot of information. I will refer to it on a couple of occasions in this presentation, simply because it deals with the school district that I'm familiar with in the San Antonio area, and some of the problems that they've had related to understanding their student base and understanding the needs of the students in that particular district. It's an interesting read, and for lack of a better description, I would recommend it to everyone, simply because of the historical value that it has, and a lot of the information related to what worked and what didn't work, and sort of the state that that district is in right now. If it's the district that I believe it is, they still, to this day, are undergoing quite a bit of change and have had their issues. And the Texas Education Association has, on a number of occasions, had to deal directly with the administration of that particular ISD, and it has been in the news quite a bit in our area. So let's move on. Some of the financial figures and ISD figures in general on this slide are a little old in relation to where we're at now, but according to the 2016 Financial Responsibility Guide from the Texas Association of School Boards, Texas public schools serve about 5.1 million students, and I'm sure that number has increased in the years since 2016. There are 1,022 independent school districts. There are 182 charter school districts, which I believe that number is quite a bit higher now. There are 8,500 campuses, including the charter schools, which again, I believe that number's increased substantially since 2016. Texas school districts are budgeted a total of $53.8 billion for the 2015-2016 school year. And as I'm sure we're all aware, that number is probably substantially higher now. But in 2013-2014, each student was basically allotted, or the cost for each student was about $8,718. Texas has developed a tiered system, a two-tier system for primary funding, for funding for school districts. About 89% of it comes from the primary funding comes from state and local. To determine how funding is allocated, Texas's Foundation School Program, or the FSP, utilizes this two-tier system. Basically, Tier 1 calculates and identifies state and local resource requirements for basic education. Tier 2 provides enrichment resources from state and local resources. Both of the tiers are intended to be based on district and student needs and not local property wealth levels, in theory. Unfortunately, some higher wealth districts raise and keep more revenue than lower wealth districts. And a few years ago in Texas, we voted on what was referred to as the Robin Hood Law, which was essentially taking state funding, and I believe a little federal funding, from the more wealthy districts and dispersing it among the low-income districts and the less wealthy districts to try to even out the amount of funding that each district got in a way that it would improve the overall response of the poorer districts. There are basically three sources of revenue. The first being local revenue. Local ISDs have the authority to levy and collect property taxes, as all of us who pay property taxes know very well. The County Appraisal District provides a roll of taxable property situated in the district, and the ISD uses that roll to calculate the tax rate needed to fund the district. State revenue for education is basically broken down into three areas: the Foundation School Fund, the General Revenue Fund, and then special funds. The special funds allow for instructional materials allotments, the available school fund, lottery proceeds, which, in my estimation, and knowing a little bit of the history of how the lottery came about, is questionable at best. I don't think the state education system ever got the lottery proceeds issue worked out. I know that when the lottery issue was on the ballot, that one of the promises was that every penny from the lottery would go to school districts. And I think they've fallen way short of that. Then, of course, there's also the Property Tax Relief Fund, all of which resulted in, 2016-17, approximately $44.2 billion worth of state revenue. Federal revenue for education is intended to supplement educational programs offered by various districts. Generally, federal revenue is provided for specific purposes, such as the federal program to provide free reduced price lunches for low-income students, and a number of other programs aimed at assisting districts with some of their low-income students. Some funds are expended at the state level, and then the state disperses. And federal funds account for about 10% of all budgeted funds for Texas public education in 2016 and 17. Suburban demographic change, and specifically the dynamics of suburban demographic change. I got this from the Educational Administration Quarterly, and it kind of popped out at me as something worth mentioning. According to Dreyer, Mollenkopf, and Swanstrom in 2004, from the mid-20th century to the 1990s, suburbs and the school system systems that served them were home to primarily white middle-class families. And they provided a way for white middle-class families to insulate themselves from urban problems and associated issues with urban living. Continuing with the dynamics of suburban demographic change, we look at the stretch from 1990 to 2010. The white suburbanite population declined from 81% to 65%. Hispanic populations in suburban areas increased from 8% to about 17%. The black population increased up to about 10%. Suburbs currently are home to more than half of all racial and ethnic groups, with a growing proportion of low-income families, as well as families who or basically English is not their primary language, and that obviously it creates some barriers. Also, keep in mind that not all suburbs are affected by these changes. There are some suburbs that are, still 80 to 90% white, and will probably continue to be for a number of years, just due to their location and the cost for some of those suburban areas to move into is prohibitive for low-income families. This is an extension of the slide just before this. This one specifically discusses the Southern ISD demographic changes from 99 to 2010. As you can see, the first two columns pretty much explain themselves, but the percent change is where I want to focus. The demographic group for the white students declined by 2.8% over this basically 10-year period. African American population increased by 30.7. The Hispanic population increased by 73.7. Native American 87.8. Asian 125.3%. Limited English proficient 225.7%. And economically disadvantaged increased by 57.8%. It's all amounts that are somewhat surprising, in that the percentages are so high in some of these areas. And I believe that the opportunities for immigrants as well as for lower income and disadvantaged folks have increased in a way that living in the suburbs is actually more economical in the long run for a number of folks that were stuck in urban areas prior to the change of the century. This slide kind of relates back to the Southern ISD issues. I think that there was a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of racial divide in that district and in a number of districts throughout the country. Primarily, failed attempts to challenge addressing social divisions by educators was a problem. Engaging in superficial diversity recognition, minimalizing of cultural values, failure to address racism within district employees, all of these things created windfall, if you will, for that district and put them at a disadvantage rather than equity-minded change requiring addressing the normative aspects of schooling, you know, confronting common sense ideologies of intelligence, merit, and structures resulting from such ideologies, such as academic tracking. Equity-minded change was what was needed at the Southern ISD. Also, changing deep culture of schools by challenging deficit views of non-dominant cultures and non-dominant cultural capital. This view was found to be problematic, according to Cooper and Evans studies in 2009 and 2007. Trying to force feed people a different approach to their culture, or to force feed another culture upon them, didn't work and doesn't work to this day. It's not cultural change that needs to take place necessarily in the districts. It's change in the approaches of how to teach. So with these few things that I've mentioned in mind, I'd like to present a couple of questions to the readers. Based on the Youngman reading, if income taxes constituted the primary local revenue source and property taxes were imposed at the state level, the school finance debate could continue as it stands, merely substituting the term income tax for property tax. Do you agree with this assessment, and why? And question number 2, based on the information provided in the Financial Responsibility Guide from the Texas Association of School Boards, Incorporated, what are your feelings on the current condition of school finance in Texas? Are we there yet? The simple answer is no. I mean, we've been trying for half a century to straighten out school finance and to find a way to make everyone happy with it. Can we get there? Eventually we will. I think that as a nation, not just the state of Texas, but as a nation, we have to evaluate what's important to us and what things should take precedence in the education of our children from pre-K to college level needs to be reassessed and better understood by everyone involved. It's a sticky subject. I wish I hadn't been in this first group, because this is a touchy one for everyone, especially if you're a property owner and your property taxes are affected by the high tax levies for school districts. But at the same time, again, what's most important? And the bottom line is that it's our children and our children's children and those who come after them. We've got to realign what's important and decide how we're going to fund it. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.